morning, everybody. I'm so excited to be here today. And again, my name's Alyssa Chapman with Gordian, and thrilled to introduce our esteemed panel today. We've got Genard Phillips, who is the Chief of Business Operations for Shelby County Schools, Jeremy Trimble, who is the Chief Operations Officer for Eanes ISD, and Karin Goldmark, the very recently former Deputy Chancellor of School Planning and Development for New York City Department of Ed. So our panel discussion today, we've got about 5 topics, and hopefully we'll get through all of them. We'll see how it goes. We're expecting to have an interactive conversation today. The first topic, which I think we could spend a full hour on, is on leadership through COVID. So I'll throw out the first question. It's a little bit of a meaty one, but please feel free to jump in. How have leaders been keeping students and staff safe? And you can answer this in whatever context is most relevant for you today. Anyone want to jump in first?
Starting with an easy question.
That's right.
You just volunteered, Karin.
There you go. I think so.
Appreciate you.
First.
Okay. Well, we did go first in the pandemic, so I guess we'll go first in the question. So, at least in the United States. So, New York City, as I'm sure you all saw rather painfully, we got hit really hard in the first wave in March 2020. And we made the difficult decision to close schools. Not clear from a public health point of view whether that actually helped or not, but the entire city was shut down, and parents were keeping their children out of schools. And it did seem like the city needed to stop everything, stop the subways, stop indoor restaurant dining and nightclubs and Broadway shows and everything that hopefully you've come to New York and love New York City for. So we went into this freeze state in a lot of cities. I think the whole country felt this way. With respect to schools, we knew that we had to shut the schools and that we had to be there for our essential workers. So we had 6 days from shutdown to startup of what we called regional enrichment centers. And these were emergency childcare centers, essentially for folks who really did not have another option because most parents wanted to keep their children at home. But we had a lot of families, for example, a police officer and a nurse married to each other. Their family doesn't live in New York City. And what were they going to do with their child? So in 6 days, we never actually closed our buildings, and I think all of us know that. I heard some of those comments last night. So, but we shut the schools and we opened emergency childcare centers, and we had to figure out in that really early context, this was before we knew that masks help, this was before we knew much of anything, how to actually operate those centers safely. So we did that at that point with the 6 feet of social distancing. And we opened 178, I believe, and quickly were able to consolidate that into 78 sites. And those sites actually taught us almost everything we needed to know to reopen schools, about how to flow through a building, how to actually encourage mask use without being punitive, how to bring some joy to the situation that was very tense and traumatic for the children whose parents were leaving every day to keep the rest of us alive. So that moment, obviously, was of the utmost importance, and what was really helpful is that the numbers were really small, so that we went down to serving 1,000 kids from serving 1 million, and then we came back to serving 10,000 kids, and then we served 400,000 when we reopened schools, and we were able to do that in stages, and eventually this past fall, we came back full attendance. And that work, which people stepped forward to do voluntarily, was intense and high pressure, and very few of us got any sleep. But it was also the fastest learning I've ever seen the school system do. And that was really what my big takeaway was. Our large public institutions are actually capable of tremendous speed, tremendous decision-making, tremendous action when it's deeply felt to be necessary. And so I think the question moving forward is, can we bring that same urgency to kids learning to read that we brought to the life and death questions we've been facing.
Great, thank you so much. Continuing in that topic, what mitigation strategies were put in place as school districts have tackled new waves and variants, and how are you preparing for the next public health emergency?
I'll start with that one. One thing to understand is that we know a lot more about just the virus. We all became epidemiologists overnight, whether you wanted to or not. One thing is that back in March of 2020, I could ask who's been through a pandemic, and you're not going to see a lot of hands. I can ask that today, and I imagine there's a lot of hands gone up. A lot of us have gone through that. So we know more. We had to educate ourselves, and we took a lot of time to do that from March to around August of 2020. And so now understanding what works and what doesn't, unfortunately, there's still a lot of confusion out there, and what strategy is best for all school districts. And I think we can answer that question is there is no strategy that works for everyone. And I've learned a lot in just listening to others in other school districts on some of the challenges they have. We're in Austin, Texas. Yes, we do have ventilation systems. We have to. And so now all of a sudden we have a platform that we can leverage for whatever strategy it is, whether it's bipolar ionization, whether it's peroxide, whatever that strategy is. So now we have something in place because we've implemented that technology. And then just understanding how people feel safe. We did a lot of what we see around everywhere is plexiglass. Right? Plexiglass, let's do plexiglass. Knowing that if the virus is there, it's not going to stop around the edges of the plexiglass, right? I mean, you hated to do it, but you know what? It kept
Perception.
Yeah, the perception, and also we started out what are our teachers and our staff going to feel safe with, what strategies in their classroom, because if we don't have them in the classroom, then it doesn't matter what we do because the students can't come because you don't want me teaching your child, so you need your teacher. And it's listening to our staff, I think, really helped. So continuing to listen to the staff, see what science is out there, and following the science as much as possible.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So keeping with the HVAC theme there a bit, so what strategies or changes have you implemented around indoor air quality, air filtration, air exchange, and are you seeing any challenges associated with those upgrades, other infrastructure challenges? I'm going to get you into the pool here, Genard.
So yes, we certainly took extensive measures to improve indoor air quality. We first started by taking some measurements in our buildings so we could, get a baseline, understanding what the contaminants were in the air, presence of mold, that sort of thing, just so that we could have a baseline of measurements so that whatever strategy or whatever technology we installed, we could see if we made a marked improvement with it. So we started there. Of course, we looked at all the different technologies, UVC, needle point bipolar ionization, higher air filtration, HEPA filtration, and the like. In Memphis, though, we ended up settling on needle point bipolar ionization. But it was primarily because not that we thought it was the absolute best technology. We thought it was a good technology, and the science supported what we thought it could do to improve indoor air quality. But it also matched the HVAC infrastructure that we already had in place. For some of the technology, like HEPA filtration, for example, or even trying to increase the MERV rating on the filtration systems we had, we would have ended up having to change a lot of that infrastructure, a lot of the mechanical systems. So we didn't feel that was feasible. Bipolar ionization was nice because we could integrate it with our existing ventilation systems and still get that improvement and that benefit without having to do a lot of capital investment in replacing mechanical systems. It was a little bit more feasible to integrate it with what we had. And so that was the approach we took. But again, the key is measuring, because you can't exactly measure pathogens in the air. You can't measure how much coronavirus is in the air, but you can measure how much contaminants you're taking out of the air, including coronavirus, which is of the same size as the contaminants that could be present. So that was our approach, doing before and after, and making sure that we were introducing enough air exchanges in the environment, in the schools, and in our central office buildings to ensure that we were improving that indoor air quality.
Great.
Can I,
Please.
since we did something different.
Yeah.
So we went with MERV 13 filters everywhere in the New York City school system. And we are very lucky in that, ordinarily I wouldn't say this, but we're very lucky in that a third of our buildings are over 100 years old. And that means that they were actually built in response to the flu pandemic and to tuberculosis. And so they were built with giant windows and heating systems that were designed to pump out twice the heat that is needed so that the windows could stay open. And so in all of those buildings, all we had to do was make sure the windows could open and run the heat like we normally do. New York City schools that are old are famous for being too hot and too cold, and we did that. And we got complaints about it, but those are the kind of complaints you're happy to take in years like we've just had. So in one respect, there was that kind of, the pandemics of the past were actually there for us as a resource. And in every building, air conditioner units, central HVAC systems, whatever it was, we put in MERV 13 filters. We inspected every building's HVAC system to make sure it was running as designed and that the air exchange was sufficient to exchange the air 6 times per hour as is required. And it was actually a summer of repair, that summer of 2020. People were running around, unbolting windows, changing filters, getting HVAC systems up and running. And we did one internal inspection to figure out what we need to fix. And then we had our partner, the school construction agency, use their vendors to do a subsequent inspection to make sure everything was ready to go. And we actually could have opened every single building in New York City. There was one building that was highly controversial prior to the pandemic around air quality issues. And we decided with that building, to the point about feelings and safety, we didn't want to push it because honestly, in this room, if you say all 1,435 buildings in New York City are ready to open, people won't believe you. But if you say these 3 have problems when we fix 2 of them and this one's not ready to go, then it actually bolsters confidence in the whole system. And people were saying, I'm not going back in that building. So we actually, our friends next door from CUNY in the higher ed space lent us space. And we had one high school that did not reopen until January, and we made further improvements to the HVAC system. But for us, that MERV 13 pervasive across the system was really key, so that in addition to the windows being open, which is a little tough in January and February, which we kept, but we also had air filtration systems operating, dampers all the way open. I'm sure these are things you're all used to and that you all did as well. And it was, for us, it was all about the air exchange, making sure it's there.
Thank you, Karin. I know that supply chain is an ongoing challenge and it has taken its own road and twists and turns. And how are you collaborating differently or considering collaborating differently with your colleagues, knowing now what you know?
Well, we talked about this earlier together as a group. So in my district, we're a smaller district, but we're surrounded by larger districts. And even just looking at the capacity that Karin has, and even Genard, and just looking at how large those districts are and the buying power that they may have, I think it was a missed opportunity when we all went into this and not partnering with as a smaller district, not partnering with larger districts to have buying power. Because otherwise they're going to take everything and there's not going to be anything left over. So we had to race out the gates to try to get those orders in to get in front of some of the larger districts. So I think moving forward that I've had conversations with those school districts around us that when you go out trying to buy something, let's talk first because we all need the same things. And I think it will help us along the way. And so we've started to do that in different supplies. We did it actually with plexiglass to start. That was our kind of first try. Go round is partnering together. So I think it's going to be very, very important that we do that, mostly for supplies, but even other technologies may lend itself to those partnerships.
Yeah, or just knowledge.
Sure. In Memphis, we did take that approach. Obviously, we tried to get out first and try to make sure that we were able to tap into the supply chain before some of the other governmental entities started to eat up a lot of the supply out there with that supply-demand situation. But a lot of the neighboring districts that are smaller than us, they did join forces with us, or basically piggyback on our purchases. So we made some of those initial purchases of a lot of the PPE, safety barriers, and the like, and then they joined with us, including when we went one-to-one for digital devices. So we made that big push to try to distribute devices to all the students in the community in the area. But we started it with our district, but then some of the smaller neighboring districts joined forces with us and piggyback off our buy to buy for their students as well. So it did help. Certainly there was a crunch to try to get after the supply before everyone began to attack it, and there would be a shortage. The lead time remained an issue, but obviously once we joined forces to capitalize on that combined buying power, we were able to make some reservations to get some of that equipment and hardware that we needed.
Yeah, thank you. Have you changed how you define risk and resiliency?
Wow.
Yeah. Anyone want to?
I think you have a good story to tell.
So, yes, I guess is the short answer to that question. So, I think there are a couple of factors at play. The pandemic is obviously center front of mind. There's also all of what's happening in terms of climate unpredictability, if you want to call it that. But watching what's been happening nationally, with Texas having a cold snap like I've never seen it, and having, understandably, 19 snowplows in the state, that sounded like the right number to me for Texas, honestly. It just happened not to be last year. And in New York City, we've long, ever since, long maybe not, but since Superstorm Sandy in 2012, we've had our eye on all of the schools that are in the low-lying areas that are going to be at risk for coastal flooding. And we had a lot of schools that got damaged. And then we had Superstorm Ida, which was a massive rainstorm. And we got, I can't remember the exact number, I think it was like 7 inches of rain in 24 hours. And people actually drowned in their homes in some basement apartments that were not up to code. It was a terrible tragedy. And we also sustained damage to hundreds of buildings and schools that weren't in the coastal low-lying areas. And for us, that was a giant wake-up call around how we think about risk and how we think about resilience, because it's much less predictable which buildings you're going to need to worry about, which communities you're going to need to worry about. You can actually, sadly, in the United States, you can know that you're going to need to be ready to serve low-income communities because of the disparity in resources and service, really government service across this country. And definitely that's definitely true in New York City. But you cannot predict just by looking at a map and saying, hey, who's 20 feet above sea level and who's 160 feet above sea level, which building is going to sustain damage in some of the climate events that we're seeing. So for us, there's this right now reassessment of risk and resiliency. And with respect to the pandemic, it was every building and every school and every child, right? So I think we're still in the middle of figuring that out. I don't feel like I have a lot of wisdom on it. It's more just awareness that how we think about that has to change. And to me, one of the answers is actually having resilience be something that we think about at a community level and something that we think about for each and every building. And sort of how is this building going to be ready to serve its community? For example, with food, we fed 1 million New Yorkers a day using our school food infrastructure because people did not know if or how they were going to eat when so many people were thrown out of work so abruptly. And so resilience has these multiple dimensions to it. And I really think that schools and school buildings are anchors of that resilience in the community. And we have to take that. To me, it makes our work so much more important. It's an honor to serve in that way. It also means we have to think far out in advance about what we need to be ready for, because we don't actually know what we need to be ready for.
Great, thank you so much. Does anyone else want to?
Yeah, I will just piggyback off of Karin's comments, especially when you speak about being an anchor. The school buildings being an anchor in the community. Certainly, we find that to be the case in Memphis as well. And we were that foundational food supply for a lot of the food deserts around the area in Memphis, and that food insecurity during the pandemic, because a lot of a lot of the infrastructure for grocery stores and what have you weren't available. Folks weren't able to go to work or even drive in some cases because they didn't have fuel to they just weren't working. So that team of nutrition folks, we were the essential workers, like the fire department and like the police department. We were the ones going into the buildings and preparing to distribute meals across the entire community. And we ended up doing it in bulk fashion, taking frozen food items, packaging them up 5, 6, 7 days of meals at a time, multiple meals for the day, and then creating these drive-up services so folks could come by and pick up. In many cases, a car would come and pick up for 2 or 3 families because everyone couldn't get out at the time. So definitely anchors in the community. Our job is bigger than what we think about just education in many cases.
Great, thank you. And it's a great way to transition to our next topic around staffing and labor challenges. Can you share some of your strategies around hiring and workforce development?
Well, there's 11 million jobs out there that don't have employees. So we're all contributing to that 11 million. And I think we have to think a little bit differently. Because we can create as many positions, we can fund as many positions as we want. Doesn't matter. We can pay them whatever we want. It doesn't matter because they're not there. Some of them have just left the industry. And so we're seeing a huge struggle. And I see a lot of people just putting money towards it. And I'm not sure that that's it. I think, unfortunately, we're in a waiting game, a waiting period. Hopefully that everyone starts coming back into the workforce. But some of the strategies like that we've used is it may not be a daily issue. It just may be certain situations. Like in our district, I created what I call our Flywheel Team. And if you know what a flywheel is, it basically doubles down on the force. And so we have a group of between 50 and 75 people that we are on a communication stream. And if we know there's any need across the entire district, we try to put someone in that position. That may be myself serving meals at an elementary, middle, or high school. I have that time. I can go help in the morning. And so we all contribute time, because if you take 75 people and all the opportunities they have in the day, they may have an hour just go help. That's what we're trying to do, so everyone respects and understands what everyone's going through, because it's just not our industry. It's teachers as well. I think the teacher is probably worse situation than we have in our facilities and operations group. So that's one thing. We're trying to utilize the resources and the people that we have, because it does feel good to help, and it's very hard for some large districts to introduce something like that. But I think it's strategies like that, thinking outside the box, because even if we go to an outsourcing company or something, like, they're having the same struggles we are.
Right.
So I think everyone hasn't figured that out. If you have, I welcome you at the end of this presentation to talk about that, so you can share that. But I would love to hear other people's strategies, and maybe we do that after this, but I'd love to hear if anyone's figured it out.
Great. And then we heard a lot last night about the loss of institutional knowledge, mainly associated with the silver tsunami.
Right.
Are you feeling that impact, and how are you preparing for that?
Well, yeah, I'll speak on it. Certainly feeling that impact, especially in the skilled craftsman areas. We've certainly, as a district and as a community in Memphis, seen a lot of folks retire. And the pandemic just, sped that process up. So folks were planning to retire. I'm going to work three more years, 5 more years. And it's like, I'm retiring next month. I'm done. And of course, that created a bigger void, if you will. And unfortunately, we've seen in that same community where we've got this group of skilled workforce, and they're in their senior retirement age. We haven't had the numbers of students and just other folks that are being trained to backfill that gap. So obviously, we have efforts going today. We're putting a really big focus on college career and technology education. And I think in Tennessee in general, they've been doing it for the past few years, but it takes a while for you to reap the benefits of that. So we've got this gap. We've certainly been trying to encourage those retirees to hang on a little bit longer so we can retain that institutional knowledge, but also just so that we can keep that level of vast capacity and bandwidth in place until we can start to bring this younger group of professionals to come in and fill those voids.
I'll just say in New York, one of the things that we have to start to look at is how we define qualified or qualifications, because we definitely have a wave of retirements, for sure. I think everyone does. We also have a lot of people in New York City who have a lot of lived experience that is relevant but not translatable. So one of the often overlooked phenomenons in a city that is essentially full of immigrants. I mean, if you count people who are born to one parent, including me, at least one parent who's an immigrant, New York City is, and if you're counting everybody being from somewhere, like if you count the American South, New York City is largely an immigrant city by any measure. And so people often actually have experience that isn't validated in the American system, but that is experience. And if we could find ways to acknowledge and recognize that, that's one way to change this kind of moment from a sense of a loss of knowledge to a sense of a blending in of, let's actually have folks who are getting ready to retire engage in mentoring relationships where they're really transferring that knowledge, like we heard last night from Kim, to people who actually have highly relevant experience. And this is just one example. There are so many examples, but if you talk to a taxi driver in New York City and you ask them what they did in the country that they came from, they will tell you something that is not driving a taxi.
Sure.
And if you ask a grocer, they will tell you they were an engineer and they came here because they want their kids to have a better shot. And it is, people come from all walks of life, obviously, but there's so much talent. And if you talk with New Yorkers who grew up in New York, not having a lot, they found ways to get by and they have expertise that actually isn't recognized in our formal systems. And so this is something where we're actually really trying to take a look at non-traditional pathways into very stable, good-paying jobs that are going to be available as the retirements happen. And that is actually something that I think is work for all of us, because we need the work done, and there are people who can do it. In this exact moment, apparently, we're either not paying enough or the risk-reward of the job isn't enough, but I do think there's a moment, an opportunity for us to figure out how to craft career paths that do make it worthwhile and that are interesting to people.
Add that real quick. Another thing is when we hire people, they come with a resume, a track record on what their work experience is. But you don't go Karin's like, oh yeah, I remember all this, what you did leading up to coming to the school K12 industry. You don't know that. You can't remember that. A good example that we had is I had a bus driver, and this bus driver is hardest working, just a young guy. But I found out that he was going to leave us. Leaving us, why? Because he had to work like 2 jobs just trying to make a living for his family. And so I went and talked to him. I was like, so why, have you looked outside transportation? Like, I was driving a bus. Have you looked at other opportunities across the district? Because, and I started talking to him, and he has a whole lot of experience prior to driving a bus for maintaining grounds and doing equipment and things like that. I'm like, wait a minute. I've got my ground supervisor's leaving because he's retiring. And for many of the reasons that Kim shared last night, that he has to manage a bunch of millennials and he can't deal with it. But that, and he's like, I'm out. And they just don't work. But that was an opportunity. It's like, wait a minute, you have all this experience. Have you ever considered this? and then went through the interview process. And that gentleman is now going to phase into our ground supervisor who has 2 months of overlap to learn. And it just, if you talk to your employees, sometimes you find out it's a taxi driver thing. Like, wow, you have a lot of experience. I would have never known that. And he wouldn't even considered it because he's like, well, I need to go drive something. And that's not his future. His future is probably somewhere else. So I think just talking to your employees, see if there's a diamond in the rough, someone who has some experience that really doesn't understand how valuable that past experience is to you and moving forward.
Some great examples of creative thinking and creative approaches. Any suggestions on addressing the wage gap? We're hearing more and more about competing with rising minimum wages with places like Amazon, Target, or people looking for jobs that have more flexible hours. Any ideas there?
Well, it's a big one in Memphis. Memphis is largely a distribution and warehouse environment. So you have a lot of the workforce, especially for those entry-level type positions. Folks are taking those jobs, and for some of our entry-level type positions or those jobs that require a lot of less skill, maybe more labor, we're competing with that industry or those industries for that employee. Certainly, we are trying to compete with the sign-on bonuses, that sort of thing. Certainly, we've taken a look at bumping up our, pay rate to compete. I mean, we've even got some of those outfits that saying we'll pay you every day, as opposed to running payroll and paying you every 2 weeks. So we've even considered, how we might compete in that space. Difficult in the K12 district, right? So we probably won't be able to do that, but. We've certainly been looking at all of the things that we find folks in the other industries do to try to make ourselves be more attractive. One of the things that we found is that, let's take, for example, a custodial employee. Many times the custodial positions don't require a full 8 hours to do the job. They may be 4 or 5 hour positions, but the same is true for our nutrition workers. The nutrition staff is a 4 or 5 hour job. So we've been trying to attract those employees to pick up both of those jobs. Do nutrition during the day and do custodial in the afternoon. Both are needs for the district, and especially if you have a student in the school, what better way to be near your child than to be working in the school doing a job that's needed in the district. So we've been trying to appeal that way. So as we do job fairs, we're talking about that part-time position, but you combine the two of them, and now you've got a full-time job, and you're sharing the same schedule as your student that may be in the same school.
Great. So we're going to move a little bit to deferred maintenance and infrastructure investment. Always a hot topic that we could spend a bit of time on. But specific to COVID, how has that helped move the needle for historically underfunded maintenance and facility infrastructure? Getting federal dollars, it's really brought things to a head. Would anyone like to speak to that?
I'll jump on that one too.
Okay.
Certainly, it's been a good shot in the arm in Memphis for Shelby County schools, for all of the districts there, for that matter. We definitely had a high deferred maintenance burden. A lot of aging schools with aging infrastructure. Probably the average age of our school buildings is probably 45 to 50 years old at this point. So, we've got some new facilities. We've got plenty that are 100 years old or more. So our deferred maintenance burden was high, about $500 million about 4 or 5 years ago when we took a snapshot and did facility condition assessment. So this shot in the arm, having the federal dollars with ESSER, for example, has been great. Of course, it can't be the cure-all or fix-all because it's not unlimited funding, of course. It's not enough to offset the entire deferred maintenance burden that we have. But it certainly is a shot in the arm, a little bit more dollars than we would have had we just been continuing to invest for capital to address deferred maintenance in the past. So it's been great. The one challenge that we're facing now, though, is that those dollars aren't going as far as they were pre-pandemic. So, we're seeing 40% increases in the cost for mechanical system replacements and new construction. things that we could have done 3 projects for the price of 1. So we're not getting the bang for the buck like we thought we could have or would have, but it's certainly better than poking the eye.
Right. So would anyone like to speak to how supply chain is impacting deadlines associated with funding?
Well, so New York we have a couple of factors. And actually, I do want to take one moment to acknowledge what a shift the funding difference has made. So for New York City in particular, we've had a series of investments by the city in the capital plan. For the first time ever, we've got all the seats that we need funded, and the largest ever capital improvement plan. So not enough to get us out of all the deferred maintenance, but more than ever before. And then on the state level, the state committed to funding the per pupil cost of educating children in New York City for the first time. And then the federal stimulus funding came in. So for us, it's been a little bit like we spent decades feeling like and literally not having enough funding, and now we have abundance and we're just getting used to it. And what do you do with it? Even with the prices going up, it's just a mind shift for everyone in the district of we used to not have enough, and for now we do. So that limit has gone away. But your point, Alyssa, there are other limits. And for us, we had an 8-month construction pause where all construction projects in the city, including education projects, were shut down. And then private construction started back up, but the city didn't start back up as quickly. And so 8 months of no projects leaves us with a tremendous backlog and delay. So we have the supply challenges that everyone has, but we also just have the pipeline challenge of we lost a year on some of our new buildings because 8 months means the following September. So we're encountering less on the supply chain end, honestly, and more on the pipeline end and our own capacity to double up on the number of projects, which we just can't do. We're sort of full on that. So that's actually mitigating the supply chain issues because all that 8-month pause, we've already paid for some of those supplies. We're doing okay, but the costs are noticeably higher. So it's now $150,000 per seat for a new building in New York City, and that is going to have real impact on the road.
So let's shift a little bit into the future of learning and learning environments. Are you thinking about, or have you already begun to incorporate outdoor learning for your facilities? And if so, how are you doing that? And how's it going?
I'll take that one. So the climate in Memphis generally supports us doing more outdoor learning, and we are embracing that. We certainly put some extra dollars actually toward that, and we're investing in outdoor learning spaces almost for every school that we have in the district. Obviously, it's been different for us because a lot of the site plans didn't necessarily support that, so we're having to rethink how the grounds are set up at our schools. But we're certainly taking advantage of it where we can, and many classes, even though it may not be a bona fide outdoor learning space, teachers are taking the liberties of taking their classes outdoors, doing some, I guess you call it walking educational practices. So it's been really good. But the climate of Memphis can support that for several months throughout the year. It gets pretty warm, hot and humid in Memphis. And of course, we're not like the Midwest. It doesn't get brutally cold, but we do have some inclement weather days in the winter. So there are these moments of periods throughout the school year where we can take advantage of it.
I think outdoor learning environments have always, I don't want to say always, but there's been a trend to go to new facilities, outdoor learning environments, great. And then, say in Texas, they're not utilized like the purpose that they wanted them to serve. Now they're utilized. And so I think that's a gain that we got out of it.
Right.
You know, the teachers got out of the classroom and started utilizing outdoor spaces, and now we can adjust some of those. So I think it's going to continue to be a trend in educational design to provide those opportunities. We in Texas stopped doing operable windows. for a while. So now, all of a sudden, do we pivot that because we don't want little kids smashing their fingers? So now do we pivot on that, though, to look at what it can provide for situations like that? So I think that could be a huge gain. One of the things that we noticed was that we have a lot of older buildings with like new flexible furniture, and a lot of flexible furniture is not in the shape of a square or a rectangle, and so it's this big curvy desk. And I'm telling you, when you're trying to space desks 6 feet apart, it just is really complicated, and it doesn't work. So I can take a classroom full of square desks and just within minutes set it up, and then I have all these weird shapes, and so that was one thing that now all of a sudden when we go back to looking at our flexible furniture in the learning environment, like, do we want to maybe not get the wavy shapes and get back to more geometry here to fit in the spaces that we have? That was one restriction that we had. If we're going to say 6 feet, we want to get to 6 feet, and we just couldn't do that with the furniture. It's just a little bit larger, but it was restricted for us.
That's great, because one of the things I was curious to hear about is, are you moving from traditional learning more into learning studios? But now I'm hearing, well, we started to do that, but now we're seeing that maybe it's not so straightforward once you have to consider social distancing.
Yeah.
Right.
Any other comments on making that type of shift?
Yeah, so, wow, there's a lot to say here. Just one plug for outdoor learning in New York City, which is obviously a little more complicated, but we did everything. We closed down streets, we took over parks, we used schoolyards. It was and to the credit of the city governance and the mayor, this was the top priority. He basically told the Department of Transportation, you get to say yes to them, you have to close the streets. He told the police department, you have to be there, you got to put up the barricades, which was a tremendous help to schools, not just the public schools. Of the 800 schools that used that opportunity, I think a third of them were private schools, which often didn't have the space because they were on these tighter spots. In terms of shape of desk and rooms, we've got a lot going on. There's the need to be able to we're still trying to do 3 feet wherever possible, as the CDC guidelines say. So it is true that the square desks help with that, but then you see this kids in rows, which we had finally worked our way out of. And one of the things that we've been hearing from kids, and we did a collaboration with Dr. Chris Emden to create a classroom, a post-pandemic classroom. He designed it during this residency he did at Lincoln Center, and then we put it in a school, and the students love it because it's a different layout. You can still maintain the 3 feet, but there are different sections. There's a section with a raised platform with grass on it. There are yoga balls you can sit on, so even actually more flexible than the desks. And one of the things the students have said to us is, going from classroom to classroom and having every classroom look the same is so boring, turns me off. And so it's not that expensive, but one of the things we're trying to do is have the classrooms not all look like each other, right? So there's this way of introducing different learning environments. Some of it's outdoor, some of it's a classroom that doesn't look like most classrooms, some of it's a classroom that does look like a classroom you're used to. And getting that kind of variety is important because kids are coming back from having been able to take their class outside, having been able to take their class in their bedroom, having been able to take the class in the living room. And so they are expecting less monotony, and we need to give that to them.
Good point.
Great. So we only have a few minutes left, so I'll give you an option of one of two questions that you might want to answer. The first question is, after everything you've been through these last 20 months, what's one thing you've changed your mind about or you're thinking differently about now? Or what's the question you're most tired of hearing on any subject? And what would you like to say about it so you never have to answer it again?
Wow. I'm going to take the first question. What am I thinking differently about? Since the proliferation of devices in the hands of all students, I definitely think as a district and me personally, we look at it differently now about how devices can be used and integrated into instruction. Certainly we had to do it and do some virtual instruction while we were shuttered and weren't in schools. But no, I mean, it can truly extend the classroom day. It can truly extend the time for learning. I watch my own daughters even when they come home and how they're still engaged by having the device. It's different than when they used to open up the backpacks and take out the book to do the homework. It's certainly more engaging now, having that tablet or that iPad in front of them. And it's even different from a district perspective when we think about, again, I mentioned Memphis does have we have a few snow days here and there, but that snow day doesn't have to mean instruction is off. Instruction can continue. Teachers can push out information while children are sitting at home because they've got that device in front of them. So the learning can continue despite what may be happening from a weather standpoint or any of those times where we've been traditionally off or away from school. It can continue. That certainly has changed my perspective.
I'll address the latter, and the one question that we continue to get every single day for 18 months is, I found this air purifier at Target, and I really cannot bring it for my son's third grade class. And that happens every day, all day, and it's just just token response, because we've done so much, and we've tried to communicate what we've done within our ventilation systems to improve the conditions. That's not only going to help with COVID, it's going to help with flu, it's going to help with all sorts of things. That's that one question that we do have a good response to that, hey, guess what? We've actually done some stuff, and you just didn't hear about it. We've been pushing that information out for 12 months. You didn't read your email. But I think that's where we want them to know what we've done, because everyone here has done an incredible job in making the environment safe, and we want them to understand that. So maybe I can look at it as an opportunity to share what we've done. But yeah, I would like to not hear about all the different air filters that people found and they want to bring into the classroom.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. Karin, anything for you?
Yes, the first question. So obviously I think differently about a lot of things, and I know this is not technically a social justice conference, but I will say I've thought so much about all of the challenges that we face as a country and how angry we are at each other and about things in general a lot. And I've arrived at the importance of effort for dialogue, the importance of listening, and that fine line between oppression and respect. So what feels like oppression and what feels like respect, and how do you find the way across from one to the other? So I'm responsible, or I was responsible for community engagement when we change how we're using a building. Does it feel like we're running over the community, or does it feel like the community is deciding? And how to get from the former to the latter. And that's, this room doesn't control the 10,000 things that are challenging about that, about vaccine mandates and about police action. But in the areas that we do have influence or responsibility, how do we create the meaningful, authentic experience of respect? Because it's what changes the entire experience. So, and I have some answers, but not a lot to that question, but I think differently about the work of just going to a community meeting. I think differently about it, of deciding what we're going to do with the building. I think differently about all those questions.
Great, thank you so much. And I would like to thank our esteemed panel today for all your thoughtful input. And these conversations can continue. So Karin, Jeremy, Genard will all be available, and I'm sure they're going to seek you out as well for looking for your input. So thank you again. And with that, we'll wrap things up.
Okay, thank you guys. Echoing what you just said, this was an excellent conversation to kickstart the event, and thank you for doing a wonderful job.